Good afternoon and welcome to today's OAH online learning webinar. The Organization of American Historians is the largest professional society dedicated to the teaching and study of American history. The mission of the organization is to promote excellence in the scholarship, teaching, and presentation of American history, and to encourage wide discussion of historical questions and the equitable treatment of all practitioners of history. The OAH is located on the campus of Indiana University, Bloomington. We wish to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University, Bloomington is built on Indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. For this afternoon's webinar, we ask that you please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions of our three presenters. If you have just general questions or you want to pose a question to your fellow audience members, please feel free to use the chat function for that. I will also be available in chat if you have any questions that I can particularly help you with. And it is my pleasure today to introduce our speakers. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that they can come on screen. So all three of our presenters today are from American Oversight. American Oversight is a nonpartisan, nonprofit watchdog that advances truth, accountability, and democracy by enforcing the public's right to government records. Since their launch in March of 2017, they have obtained and published tens of thousands of documents from federal, state, and local government agencies. Records uncovered by American Oversight have supported congressional inquiries, investigative journalism, and independent actions by their partner organizations. Our three guests today are Alyssa Lopez, and she is the Strategic Partnerships Director at American Oversight, where she leads engagement with partners across key issues. She previously worked at Democracy North Carolina on democracy reform and at the ACLU advancing immigrants' rights in the Southeast. Alyssa serves on several boards, including the ACLU of North Carolina. She holds a BA in political science and a JD from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Khloe Dennison is a researcher at American Oversight. She conducts investigations using public record requests into immigration and voting rights issues, including 287G programs and the myth of the, quote, non-voting citizen, or non-citizen voting, excuse me. She has previously held positions at the New York Immigration Coalition and Democracy, North Carolina. Khloe graduated from Barnard College, Columbia University, with a degree in political science and history. And our third guest this afternoon is Emma Lewis, who is counsel at American Oversight, where she maintains an active docket of FOIA and public records litigations on behalf of the organization and clients. Her work also includes drafting and negotiating federal and state public records requests. Prior to joining American Oversight, Lewis practiced political law, counseling clients on compliance with ethics, lobbying, campaign finance, and ballot access rules. Emma received her law degree from New York University School of Law. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
We're so excited to be here with you all today, especially on a Friday afternoon. We have a little bit of a presentation for you, so we'll jump into that. Thank you, Shania, for running the presentation. Feel free to put questions in the chat, and we'll get started. This is Opening the Door to Transparency, a FOIA 101 training. We are excited to be here with you all, and we'll get started. So as was mentioned, this is a webinar format, so feel free to put questions in the chat or use the question and answer function. We'll be working to answer those throughout the presentation, but we'll also have a significant amount of time at the end of the presentation to answer questions as well. We're going to be recording this presentation and materials are going to be circulated after. To the extent that there are questions that we don't get to, we'll make sure that we can follow up via email and written materials to share with you all answers to the questions that you may have. And once again, thank you for being with us. So who are we? Well, as you know, and as Beth shared, my name is Alyssa Lopez. I'm the Strategic Partnerships Director, and I'm joined today by our researcher, Khloe Dennison, and counsel, Emma Lewis, and we're really excited to share all the nuts and bolts about FOIA with you. As was mentioned, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit watchdog. As a 501(c)(3) organization, we do not endorse or oppose candidates for office, and our work is strictly limited to educating the media, allied organizations, and the public. A little bit about the current work that we're taking on in this moment, namely federal accountability work. We do a lot of records requests that is digging into the Trump administration's policies and their practices, and the work of their allies and various agencies. We're particularly focused on the weaponization of government against vulnerable communities, and institutions like public education, and the immigration system. And we're also deeply investigating issues related to elections and voting rights at the federal level. In addition to our federal accountability work and FOIA, which we use as the tool to support that, we do a lot of state accountability work and records requests at the state level. In that area of work, we primarily focus on bad actors and policies at the state level. In the prior election cycle and in the upcoming year, we'll be focused a lot on election influence networks, and trying to combat election subversion. We've also focused a lot on the collaboration between Department of Homeland Security and ICE and immigration and local law enforcement agencies. We are deeply invested in transparency and we use a variety of tools. We have experience with FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, the Presidential Records Act, and the Federal Records Act, and we've litigated on a variety of these statutes. We also advocate for positive state laws, policies, and practices regarding transparency, such as open meetings, and have a lot of experience in that area as well. Next slide. So a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. This is a slightly longer training session because we also wanted to have a lot of time for question and answer. But we're going to start with a brief history of FOIA and then transition into FOIA 101. We're going to talk about getting started and how to draft FOIAs, some common types of FOIA requests that you might be interested in submitting. We're going to talk about submitting those requests and agency engagement. And then we'll talk about some examples in our own work and some highlights from American Oversight. And we'll close out with some FOIA resources. So there are a lot of great organizations who use FOIA as a tool and have resources to support folks. So we'll share a little bit about that at the end and then have a question and answer section. FOIA history. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Emma.
Hi, excited to be here. Excited to see Alyssa's gifts, which she's great at adding into presentations. And like Alyssa said, we're going to go through some brief history of FOIA. The push starts happening in the 50s and 60s. Takes about 10 years, a little bit more for a real push to gather momentum, but there's a growing public concern about government secrecy during the Cold War. A real person to thank here is Congressman John Moss from California, who was a real fighter for public access for, like I said, over a decade, until we get to about the 60s, where there's bipartisan support, including his partner was Donald Rumsfeld in this, and they passed the Freedom of Information Act in 1966, signed by President Johnson very reluctantly. There's no big signing, press invited signing like there are for other bills, but he does sign the bill. It doesn't have a ton of teeth in the 60s, and once we get to the 70s, the Watergate scandal highlights the need for government transparency and results in amendments that really strengthened FOIA and gave it the kind of teeth that we see make it meaningful. In the 80s and 90s, there are further reforms that expand access. This is, as is probably obvious, there's a lot new kinds of records here. Electronic records really explode as a kind of government record. And there's also faster timelines, or an attempt to get faster timelines for records. Post 9/11, there are some rollbacks to FOIA due to national security concerns. You see expanded exemptions for things that involve national security. There was a big push in 2016 for FOIA's 50th anniversary. There was bipartisan support for improving accessibility somewhat, an attempt to make all the agencies it easier to file FOIA requests through this FOIA.gov query, whether how successful this has been, and how successful some of these updates were. But there was a new and most recent updates have been in 2016. There are currently occasional hearings on FOIA, some proposed FOIA reform legislation, nothing that I would call imminent, but it is a powerful tool, albeit one with some room for improvement, and as we've seen over the course of its history. So the basics. This GIF is a little more aggressive than I think I'll be today, but you are going to learn. What is FOIA? So the Freedom of Information Act's basic purpose is, according to the statute, is to ensure an informed citizenry vital to the functioning of a democratic society, needed to check against corruption and to hold the governors accountable to the governed. In other words, it lets the public know what their government is up to. It's built on the idea that the public has ownership over the government, some level of ownership, and therefore a right to know what the government is doing. So who can use it? Anyone. Any person. That includes individuals, partnerships, corporations, associations, anyone. There's no, for the federal FOIA, there's no citizenship requirement. Anyone can submit a FOIA request. So it provides a private right of action to access public records. These must be agency records within an agency's control, and we'll talk a little bit more later about what that means. There are certain exemptions and exclusions, some of them pretty substantial. You can't get everything out of the government, but you don't need to provide a reason or an underlying justification mostly. For the vast majority, the agency cannot ask you why it is that you're asking for this information. So basically, what can't you get? You can't get anything out of a non-FOIA-able government entity. There's a lot of negatives, but Congress, not subject to FOIA, the judicial branch, not subject to FOIA, most White House offices, not subject to FOIA. So you're talking agencies mostly. These other entities are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. The statute requires a 20 business day response. They can take an extra 10 days. In practice, this is almost never a timeline that they meet. And in fact, it can take months or years to get a response, but the statute provides a 20 business day timeline. There are provisions for fee waivers for certain types of organizations. So understanding organizations, and for the purpose of allowing the public to understand federal operations and activities, and you're not going for a non-commercial purpose. And we'll talk a little bit more later about what that means. Can also ask for expedited processing in certain situations where there's an urgency to inform the public about something, and the requester primarily disseminates information. And sometimes if there's widespread media interest and a question of government integrity, that is limited to certain agencies. And if you get a sort of a bad response, a response you think doesn't give you all the records that you think exist, or they deny a fee waiver, deny expedited processing, there is an administrative appeal procedure. And that also is part, if you want to sue, you have to go through that administrative appeal procedure before you have exhausted your remedies. Did we skip a page, or we went back? All right. So basics. Basically, what is an agency? Where can you FOIA? So each authority of the government of the United States, whether or not it is within or subject to review by another agency. So this includes most of the executive branch, executive departments, military departments, government corporations, and government-controlled corporations. The only part of the executive office of the president that you can FOIA is the Office of Management and Budget. And like I said before, Congress, courts, and the White House are not subject to FOIA. And so FOIA allows you to get agency records. Not every record in an agency is an agency record. So there's a specific definition here. The agency created or obtained the materials. The agency had the materials at the time the request was made. The materials came into the agency's possession in the legitimate conduct of its official duties. This excludes personal materials. So there are things, for example, sometimes records that Congress sends to an agency and the records that the agency creates in response to a congressional inquiry are not always agency records, depending on the circumstances. But most of the time, if an agency has the records, it's probably an agency record. There's also exemptions. This is Alyssa, I think, shows how she feels about the exemptions, but agencies don't have to give you everything. They can withhold under certain exemptions. So as FOIA says, the basic policy is disclosure, not secrecy, is the dominant objective, and these exemptions must be narrowly construed. And agencies must also take reasonable steps necessary to segregate and release non-exempt information. So as you see in this sort of picture here, there's a lot they're saying is exempt here, but they can't exempt a whole page just because of one exempt thing. It looks like this is an email here, and you can see certain bits, and then probably the vast majority of the interesting things have been withheld. And so what are these exemptions? The big ones that you'll see are what we call B5, B6, and B7. These are the statutory places that you'll find them in the statute. B5 is the biggest, and that is inter or intra-agency records that would be privileged in litigation. So what that means is this is where you'll see things like attorney-client privileged product or attorney work product. They must be internal to the executive branch. The consultant corollary means that if someone is working outside of the executive branch, but essentially as a member of the executive branch, those would still be considered agency records that could be under B5. But the big one here is deliberative process privilege. If something is not subject to a final decision, then they can withhold all of that beforehand. The idea is to protect free discussion and thinking before you get to a final decision. That can be a pretty substantial, powerful tool for the agencies to withhold information. There's also B6 is personnel records and personal information or similar files. There's a balancing test. The higher up you are, the less sort of personal privacy the B6 gives you. A just regular employee would have much higher standard to meet than, say, a top official. And then B7 includes law enforcement files. There's 5 subsections, an ongoing investigation, records that would implicate a fair trial, privacy, that's another big privacy one, 7C here, that would implicate a confidential source or would show confidential law enforcement techniques. So those are the big ones. There's also some smaller ones, I think on the next page, or there we go. There's more. Commercial information, there's a lot here, geological and geophysical data about wells. You don't see a lot of B9, but depending on what records you're seeking, you could see a lot of this. If you're seeking commercial information, you'll get a lot of B4. Obviously, if you're asking for something from a national security agency, you might see B1. So there's these 9 exemptions to FOIA. And then I believe I'll pass this over to my colleague Khloe for some tips on how to draft a FOIA.
Yeah, so now I can start with covering where to start when drafting public records requests. So first, before you start drafting, it's critical to know what you're legally entitled to. And rather than asking for an overwhelming amount of records, you should try and make efforts to narrow your requests to actually receive what you're interested in and reduce the volume and time that it takes to requests. So for example, one of the smaller federal agencies is the Department of Education. And even after the massive layoffs that happened earlier this year, the Department of Education still has over 2,000 people working there. So if you ask for all directives issued on something or all communications, and it's a very broad term, the FOIA officer is not really going to know where to start. The amount of paper that 2,000 people generates is quite a lot. So as much as possible, being able to narrow and identify specific offices, individuals, search terms, or specific documents. So rather than saying something like all records concerning a topic, try and narrow in as much as possible. It is a requirement that requesters reasonably describe the records that you're after, and that means that you must provide enough information for an employee familiar with the subject of the request to understand what you're asking for. And so that's sort of a good place to start, is always try and narrow. Next up is the most important part of the request, which is the actual language of the request. I find it really useful to sort of consider what we call the 4 W's. First, what are you trying to accomplish? And that is, what are the records you're trying to find, and what would they possibly contain or reveal? Second, where are the records most likely to be? So this requires you to know which agency would have what you're looking for, but then also within an agency, which sub-office or department specifically might have those records. Third, who has these records? So this would be that sub-agency or office, but also the individuals working within the agency. When we say custodians, those are the people, like the officials who have the records, are the ones who are either drafted a memo, wrote an email, even received an email, things like that. So who actually owns the records and is interacting with them. And finally, when is the relevant date range? So rather than asking for all records from the entire time that someone has worked from an agency, I would recommend narrowing your request to a much more relevant and specific date range, as it's much easier to process. Again, it's important to be as narrow as possible so you can get records back very quickly and without really high fees. But I will flag that you often want to make sure that you don't narrow too much and exclude anything that would be of value or interest. So oftentimes, if you submit a request and it's way too broad, you can work directly with the FOIA officer to try and narrow the request. And the FOIA officer works directly in the agency, so they might have a lot of answers to these questions about the agencies, the custodians, and things like that. So I often find it's really helpful to actually work directly with the agency to narrow. So then when it comes to some tips for drafting, often I find it really useful to look at reporting on an issue to help identify the names of officials to target with requests, information about the names of specific offices, and knowing what your time frame you're after, and more. When it comes to information gathering, it can be really helpful to look at what other people have requested. So agencies typically publish FOIA logs, which list out every FOIA request made over the last year or quarter. Not all of this will be useful to you, but it can provide a really good jumping off point to understand what types of records other people might be interested in. In general, I would recommend trying to gather as much context and information about the topic as possible, whether it's through reporting, looking at agencies' published policies, memos, and more. Using the language of the agency as much as possible will get your request much further, as the FOIA officer will have an easier time interpreting what you're after and find the records that match. Additionally, if it's possible, like I mentioned, you can try and talk to agency personnel to get a better understanding of where records might be located, what they might look like or be called, and more. Additionally, I would always recommend considering agency exemptions at the outset. That you can still request this information. It's often just going to be easier to not ask for something that's going to be very exempt, as opposed to waiting potentially years for your request to come back and it's just redacted all over. So instead, I would often try and think about what it is you're interested in, what is the ideal record that you would want to receive back, what the exemptions are, and then maybe try and strategically skirt them. So instead of getting caught up in B5, which is pre-decisional information, trying to strategically think about when was a policy passed, maybe adjusting your time frame based off of that, but really thinking about exemptions so you are not getting back a ton of redacted material. And finally, try and think about records from the agency's perspective. So you know what you want, but where would an agency be keeping it? How would they be talking about this issue? And so thinking about these kinds of questions before you draft can make your request much more strategic and targeted, so you get back more records that you can actually use. And now we can cover the most common types of requests that we send here at American Oversight. So the first type of records requests are narrow and precise ones. This is for when we know or can reasonably assume that specific documents already exist. And we often know that these documents exist because of news reporting or other documents we've received from previous requests. The language in these requests can be incredibly specific. So you might reference who authored a document, the name of the document itself, and when it was written or produced. And you can also always cite news coverage that references the existence of these documents in the request itself. The second type of request that we send are broad sweeps, and these are often really basic documents like calendars, resumes, financial disclosures, and more. And oftentimes for us at American Oversight, this can be the first step of an investigation because it'll tell us really basic information like who is meeting with officials, what are potential conflicts of interest, and other general information about the inner workings of an agency. The third type of request that we often send for is external communications, and we will ask for communications sent by officials to individuals or organizations not in government or outside the agency we're requesting the information from. And so we can often ask for a general external communications request with any email ending in .com, .org, .edu, but often to narrow further, we'll ask for a really specific list of communications with a list of individuals or groups that we're really interested in. By asking for these types of external communications, it helps us avoid the federal B5 exemption for internal communications and pre-deliberation. And generally, external communications are really useful for understanding what outside groups have access to officials and also just who is influencing these government decisions. Finally, the last type of request we generally send for is key term communications. And this will be communications about a very specific issue that is happening or policy that's being proposed or rolled out. And these records are really useful for understanding what specifically is being decided on this issue, how officials are thinking or speaking about this matter, and more. And these records are very useful for if you're working on a very specific project or issue area, because you can tailor it exactly what you're interested in. For instance, communications from a Department of State official about a visa issue, you can really get into the core of the issue that you're interested in. This slide shows some sample language for drafting these types of requests. I will say, in general, the more precise or specific you can be, the better. For instance, you'll notice that for all of these examples, they include a place for you to list out the names of the officials whose records you're asking for. And that's because, if you're requesting records from state or federal agencies, these have hundreds of thousands of employees at times, like the Department of Defense or DHS. And so simply asking for all communications is not realistic. So again, just as much as possible, trying to add as much specific information to your FOIA request is going to get you a response that's a lot more relevant to your work and also just a lot faster. And I'll pass it back on over to Emma.
Hi, so after you send the request, what is it that you are going to have to do? So you are sending it in and then there's more to come. So first, to actually submit a FOIA request, there's an agency FOIA link on the website usually where it says how you submit to this particular agency. Like I said, the push to use FOIA.gov for all submissions is not been 100% successful. So there may be a portal that's specific to the agency, or there may be an email address. Very rarely is it by regular mail. A good tip is to save the email showing that a submission has been sent and any return acknowledgement you receive. Sometimes things do get lost. It is good to be able to show that they did actually receive the request. And then mark your calendar for when to expect a response or an acknowledgement. Typically, that's 20 business days. Like I said, they can send you a letter saying, due to exceptional circumstances, we're taking 10 extra business days. That's all they are allowed to do under the statute. Anything else, they have missed their deadline. In practice, that doesn't necessarily mean all that much unless you are planning to sue, but that is the amount of time the statute gives. And then so plan when and how you want to follow up with the agency after it's been submitted and after the time has elapsed. So when you're corresponding with agencies, like I said, pick a date on your calendar to follow up. You can politely remind the agency that you submitted the request, ask if there's anything that can be clarified, and ask if you can respect to receive the documents by a certain date. Sometimes they will reach out to you asking for clarification if well, you followed Khloe's rules, so you should avoid that. But they may ask for clarification or for narrowing on their own. And then if no date is provided, you can request a timeline by which the records will be produced. Once you receive the records, you may want to challenge a redaction or an exemption, use of an exemption. So you'd want to make your argument simply and succinctly to the agency, usually by email. Then you can, so that's informal follow-up. It could also be by a phone call, but if that doesn't work, you want to be able to appeal the agency response. So you think that they didn't do a complete search, they're saying they don't have any records and you think there are records, a redaction you think is wrong, anything there, not anything, there's certain number of things you can appeal, but most of these things you would find wrong, you can appeal. There's a 90-day time limit though, so you do have to submit that appeal within a certain amount of time. And then if you are moving towards litigation, you do have to exhaust the appeal remedy if they have given you some kind of response. If they just missed their deadline entirely, there's nothing to appeal, so you can go to litigation from there. But if they do give you something, you do have to go through the appeal process before you are able to sue. So some kind of specifics on things you can appeal: no records responses and the adequacy of the search. So agencies must conduct searches that are reasonably calculated to uncover all relevant documents. If you think that they have not done so, this is something you can appeal. Positive indications of overlooked material can call the search into question. For example, if there was reporting that X sent an email to Y and you asked for emails between X and Y and they did not give you an email on that day, or they didn't give you any emails at all, that's the sort of thing that you would want to include in your appeal. Lack of a search description, the agency is supposed to be able to tell you what they did. If you asked for certain people's emails and one person's emails aren't there, if you asked for a certain date range and there aren't emails or communications or records from part of that date range, all of those things can call into question the adequacy of the search. There's also withholdings. So like I talked about before, B5, which is things that could be withheld in litigation. This is inter or intra-agency, but it's supposed to be within the government. So if you see an email and it says to a .com email address and not .gov, that could be an indication that this was not kept within the government and therefore does not have a B5 protection. A directional flow of communication. Top down, if something is, usually the person at the top is the one making the decision. So if it's supposed to be pre-decisional and the email comes from a supervisor down to an employee, that could be an indication that this is not pre-decisional and thus not subject to the deliberative process privilege. Not always the case, but it's an indication that you can look at. For B6, which is personal information, email addresses are not always personal information. A successful job applicant is not subject to the same protection that an unsuccessful job applicant is. So you can look at those indications. And then for B7, B7A is only for ongoing investigations. So if they say B7A and the investigation ends, then that is not subject to B7A any longer. For fee waivers. So like I said, certain organizations or people are allowed to have fee waivers if disclosure of the information is in the public interest because it is likely to contribute significantly to public understanding of the operations or activities of the government and is not primarily in the commercial interest of the requester. So you do have to be someone or an organization that regularly disseminates this information. And you do sometimes have to prove that. You do have to make your case to the agency. If they deny and you think that you should be subject to a fee waiver, should be eligible for a fee waiver, you can appeal that denial. And similarly to expedited processing, so there's more ways to get at expedited processing, but generally if there's a compelling need for the information, imminent threat to life and safety of the individual, or if you are primarily engaged in disseminating information and there's an urgency to inform about a matter of current exigency, this is something like a hearing is coming up on a nominee or an election where the public should know something before the election. There needs to generally be something you can point to saying there's an urgency to inform the public before X date. You can make this argument about expedited processing when the request is filed or at a later date. It doesn't have to be at the time the request is submitted. And the agency must respond within 10 calendar days. You do not have to appeal the denial of expedited processing before you can go into court. But if you need the information quickly, you may want to appeal and see if you can get it through the appeals process. And then when all else fails, litigation. So you can take FOIA cases to a federal district court where you're located or the agency is located or the federal court in Washington, D.C. This is any time after 20 business days have passed without a response, unless they take an extension that is, like I said, only 10 business days. And then if there has been a response, you have to appeal first. You can't go directly into court. And I'm going to pass this to Alyssa for our highlight reel.
So I know there have been some questions coming in the chat and we're excited to answer those at the end. So just want to flag that we're aware, but we're excited to share a little bit about practically what kind of FOIA can bring to bear from our experience at American Oversight. So one of the kind of most amazing projects I've had a chance to work on in my professional career has been at American Oversight. And it culminated in a report called Deadly Failures, Preventable Deaths in U.S. Immigration Detention. It was a report that was collaborative and involved the ACLU, National Prison Project, and Physicians for Human Rights. Basically, we started, as this presentation started, reading a lot of news about deaths in ICE custody in the prior Trump administration, Trump 1.0, and we filed a bunch of FOIA requests related to individuals who died in ICE detention as reporting was coming out and as the government was releasing names. As we mentioned, oftentimes you have to litigate to get records in any meaningfully timely way. And so we sued ICE to obtain records. This was an ongoing lawsuit that was just closed out, I think, last year, and really took multiple years of litigation to get the records that we needed to tell the story about a lot of the failures of medical care in ICE detention settings. A lot of what we did helped individuals whose families were being represented by private attorneys in terms of wrongful death litigation, and also told a broader story about what happens in ICE detention and a lot of the preventable deaths that take place. We partner oftentimes with a lot of organizations. We've partnered with some folks on this call around FOIA requests. And so in this instance, we knew we wanted to partner with folks who had deeper expertise in the issues. We're amazing investigators and litigators, but we're not, comprehensively knowledgeable on all things. And so we partnered with the ACLU National Prison Project, who has litigated a lot of cases about wrongful death suits and provision of care in detention settings, including immigration detention settings, and Physicians for Human Rights, who's done a lot of amazing work leveraging medical expertise to understand human rights violations abroad, but also here in the United States. And one of the key components of this report, too, was obviously sharing these records with the families who are directly impacted by losing loved ones to, poor medical care in ICE detention, and allowing them to share their own stories. A lot of times the narrative that comes out from the government may differ, from lived experiences that folks have experienced. And this report was a great way to highlight, the lived experience and the stories of individuals from their families' perspectives. It culminated in a really beautiful opportunity for the families and advocates to go to the Hill in DC this past July. Well, actually, not this past July, in 2024, and kind of lobby and engage with congressional representatives to try to promote compassionate release for medically vulnerable populations and immigration detention, and furthermore, for transparency for ICE, whether it be FOIA or other reporting obligations. And so it's just a really powerful way in which getting records will tell a larger story, a more comprehensive story about what's happening with this increased immigration enforcement during this political time. Next slide. We've also had the opportunity to enforce access to records to prompt policy change. And so what has happened in the course of several of our investigations is we've uncovered policies that have led to either direct destruction of records or potential lack of proper records maintenance. And so here we had, submitted FOIA requests to the Department of Defense and to the Army, and it was uncovered that both the DoD and Army had wiped phones of former senior Trump officials. And that included former Defense Secretary and the Army Secretary, which meant and, ultimately resulted in a lot of missing and lost records from the January 6th insurrection. And spurred likely in large part by our litigation and attempt to uncover information about this huge historical event, the Pentagon issued new policy for text message preservation and information on mobile devices. Emma, along with many of our litigators, are encountering obviously new use of Signal and ephemeral messaging apps, which makes it really hard to obtain records at a time when they're not being properly preserved. Additionally, DHS announced that they were going to stop wiping the phones of high-level officials without backing them up. This is a Federal Records Act issue, and the public is entitled to these records. And they launched a review of their record retention practices. So sometimes even just asking for the records and forcing the government to talk about how it maintains the records if they do not have the records can prompt policy change that allows them for broader folks to request those records in the future as they're retained. Next slide. COVID-19 accountability. We filed a lot of records requests in the first year of COVID. COVID obviously was a notable event of the century, and we wanted to make sure that we were getting as much information as possible, not only for advocates to respond to issues that they were seeing on the ground in terms of vaccine provision or things like that, mask provision, but also just for posterity's sake and for the historical record. Our investigations revealed a lot. They revealed political interference in public health agencies, decision making, and their practices, delays and confusion in the testing and vaccine rollout. Obviously, this unfortunately resulted in, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, failures to protect those in detention centers and nursing homes, and the really acute threat to vulnerable populations. And because we were actively litigating and forcing the government to release these records, we were able to drive a narrative and help hold officials accountable in real time. And it also created a public record, hopefully for you all as historians, for folks who are also advocates, and for those in the news media to understand decision making during one of the most consequential health crises that we've had in modern history. And so it's another way in which being proactive in requesting this information can have, an opportunity, provide an opportunity for historical look back on records, particularly when you're ensuring that the government is on notice to preserve those records for the future. We wanted to close out before we go into question and answer, and I see questions coming in with some FOIA resources, because although we are experts in FOIA, we are not the only ones who use FOIA. And next slide. So as Khloe mentioned earlier, a great way to see what folks are requesting is to look at agency FOIA logs. Those are oftentimes on agency websites. There are many larger agencies that have a practice of updating them regularly, whether it's quarterly or annually. Or if it's a smaller agency or it's not on their website, you can get Meta and you can FOIA the agency for their own FOIA logs, which is something that some organizations do, and I think we have done in the past. And we're happy to chat with folks about that or other FOIA records work. As mentioned too, there's FOIA.gov, which, despite some challenges, does have a lot of useful information and oftentimes has annual reports that will give you broad contours of FOIA just across multiple agencies. And then there are several FOIA databases that are public databases of folks who regularly update on productions that they get, in addition to our own website. So MuckRock is a really great resource. Not only will they help you submit FOIA requests and state records requests, but they also have Document Cloud. That's where we host all of our records, where you can go and see and search for records that have already been requested. There's a FOIA project at Syracuse University. A lot of folks know their work on immigration and rolling FOIAs that they have in that space. And so that's a great resource. And then Government Attic is another great resource for FOIAs. A lot of historical older information, but also newer information, and a lot of information related to declassified documents. One thing I don't think we shared is that we do not oftentimes challenge or try to change the law related to classification of documents, whether they're classified or not. There are other organizations who specialize in that, but mainly, we're dealing with standard exemptions. But Government Attic has a good amount of declassified information too that they post through FOIAs that they've submitted. And then these are a bunch of investigative and advocacy organizations who oftentimes, if they get notable records in response to their FOIA requests or litigation, will publish them online. So our website, we have a little bit of a backlog, but to post the majority of the requests that we have that go out, but definitely notable productions. For productions that include very kind of, I don't know, topics of interest. We sometimes annotate documents to make it easier with researcher notes, but we do have a standard practice by and large of uploading the majority of the productions that we get. The ACLU does a great job of updating various websites that they have for their specific projects, whether it's the Voting Rights Project or others, with productions they get. CREW, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, also does a great job. EPIC as well, Freedom of the Press Foundation. And in terms of resources for understanding specifically state records law if you're interested. Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press has a wonderful resource that allows you to understand kind of some of the contours and exemptions in state records law, which is oftentimes modeled off of FOIA. And we'll be sharing all of this in an email to Beth to circulate to all attendees. And then many of you all are housed in universities. And so you're probably familiar with many of the university-based centers that have kind of FOIA practices of their own and repositories of information that are of interest to you all, and suggest that you all check those out. We are always happy to collaborate with folks. Be candid that this is our first time presenting to an academic audience, but we'd love to partner with you all, and please consider us a resource as you consider FOIA. Our next slide has a bunch of our information. We have a newsletter that goes out weekly that highlights a bunch of our FOIA litigation, notable records that we've received. You can email us at partnerships@americanoversight.org to plug in to all of the work that we have going on. And we are pretty active on Blue Sky, and I suppose by necessity on X and Twitter as well. And so feel free to follow us and see the latest on our investigations and records requests on social media. And now we can pivot to questions from the chat. So I'm going to start with one of the very common questions that we get related to timeliness. So the question is, I was told by the FOIA staffer who contacted me after I filed my request in fall of 2022 that it could take up to 8 years to receive information related to my requests. I did not file an expedited request because I'm a historian and not a journalist with a hot burning story. Is this wait time typical these days? And I think I'll hand it off to Emma.
8 years is a long time. I would not say that that's typical. It depends on, I think generally historians are probably asking for more information. Maybe not generally, but if you're asking for a large amount of information or a large amount of records, that could be a longer timeline. 8 years is longer than I see regularly. That being said, I've been at American Oversight for 6 years, and I am sometimes getting an email about a request that I sent in 2019 or 2020. But I would not say that that's typical. One of the things that you can do if you hear something like that is try to, if you're looking for something specific, you can work with the agency, with the FOIA representative that's assigned to your request to narrow the request, try to figure out what office that information you're actually looking for is. A lot of the questions that I have seen in the chat, part of the answer is just the requester is always at an information disadvantage. You always are not going to know everything about where the records that you want are going to be. But in my experience, I have found that FOIA officers want to help you. They also don't want to be running a huge search. And if they can give you an org chart or any information about what it is that they would have that could help you narrow and craft a search together to make sure that you're getting what you want, I have found that they are very willing to do that. I will also say that a lot of FOIA officers have been subject to rifts recently. We don't know how that is going to affect FOIA and FOIA timelines in the next year, 5 years, 10 years down the road. The reductions in forces that have been going on, so have been laid off. A lot of these FOIA offices are smaller than they were, sometimes very significantly. And so that is an unknown that we will be tracking and seeing how it affects timelines. FOIA offices at this moment have not shut down entirely. They are still working. But the timelines are long.
I had kind of two questions that go together for you all, and I think, Chloe, this might be best for you, which is folks who are researching historical information, 1910, 19 through 1940, or an investigation in the 1950s. What are some considerations relative to FOIA? And then there was a really specific question about determining which agency might have historic records. There's someone who's looking into a loyalty investigation in the 1950s, but would want to know whether they should submit their request to that agency or if there's a place that has kind of historical records.
Yeah, of course. Happy to start this. And Emma, of course, you have any thoughts, please feel free to jump in. In response to the first question, sort of about like what considerations to be aware of relative to FOIA when it comes to federal investigations between 1910 and 40, I would just try and get as specific as possible. I know I sort of am saying this ad nauseum, but as much as if you have like an example of an investigation that you want to find more copies of, for example, saying the exact name of that form, knowing exactly which office, like from 1910, was responsible for launching the investigation. Any dates you might know about when an investigation was opened or closed. For a period that long ago, the FOIA officer won't really have any understanding of, on a basic level, of what you're looking for. So they're really going to rely on you to know exactly what it is you're looking for. So as much detail and examples that you can provide of what it is you're after, the better. When it comes to determining what agency might have a historic record, I will say my strategy is always to send it to more agencies as opposed to narrowing too early on. So for instance, we've been doing a lot of requests lately on CCOT and wrongful removals to El Salvador. And so instead of just narrowing in and only sending a request to ICE, we've sent it to state and the Department of Defense and DHS at large. And so with this specific instance, I would recommend sending the request both to the current agency that the original agency might have been absorbed into, as well as the sort of umbrella organization that it was under in the 1950s. So for instance, I am thinking of INS, and I know that INS in the 30s was under the Department of Labor, and then it transferred over in the 50s onward into DOJ, and now it is under DHS. And so depending on your time frame, I would consider sending it to DHS, DOJ, or the Department of Labor, depending on what time frame you're looking at. So I would just sort of err on the side of sending it to more places than not. And if they don't have it, they're going to close it out and tell you they don't have those records, or hopefully direct you to the appropriate agency. So that would be my strategy.
Thank you. Kind of similar question. Does it matter where within an agency you send the FOIA? For example, would it be useful to send multiple FOIAs to each subject relevant, like local FBI office and the FBI headquarters in DC, or would a FOIA just to the national FOIA office in DC automatically include their local offices? And I don't know if we know the specific answer to that one, but go for it, Emma.
So I'm just going to say one thing on the last question and then move on to this one. The other thing that I want to point out, and I know this is slightly disappointing for historians who are mostly looking for things past 3 to 10 years ago, is that there are records retention schedules. There are certain things that the agencies are allowed to delete. A lot of emails, for example, are 3 years. That doesn't mean, especially for something as long ago as 1910, that they would have deleted them. But sorry, let me restart. The agency is not required to save every piece of information for eternity. And when I was speaking about the 2016 amendments, that did put a sunset provision, excuse me, on B5, so internal records, and of 25 years. And people were hoping to get much more information than they actually were able to, because it turns out that a lot of things that are 25 years old had been deleted subject to federal retention schedules. And that's the area of the Federal Records Act and not FOIA. So just want to put that out there that not all records that have been created by the agency are going to be available to you in FOIA years or decades later. Going to the FBI, I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head for the FBI in general. I think Khloe said, for example, more is better. Send it to as many places as you can. You can also, before you send a FOIA request, try to get in touch with the FOIA office. And they, like I said, are usually very happy to point you in the right direction of the right office. Sometimes you can submit a FOIA and they'll say this person's records or we don't have these records, but you should look here. Faster if you do it before you submit it, but agencies will sometimes point you in the right direction if you are not in the correct office. And agencies are generally decentralized. FOIA offices are generally decentralized. So you are going to sometimes, I would say regularly, need to go to the top of the agency and also smaller offices, smaller components that you think may have relevant records. More is better. And that's sort of the way the system is set up.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing is that when it comes to the FBI, they have one central place to send all their FOIAs. But if you want them to search a local field office, I would recommend explicitly saying that, because when they process your FOIA, they are going to do what's easiest to close it out as fast as possible. And so if you want them to search a specific office, I would include that in the request itself.
That's helpful. Okay, going down the line, Khloe, you had mentioned that records requests are available 6 months to a year. I think in reference to FOIA logs, is there a way to tell if a topic, issue, or person has been FOIA'd, or are duplicate requests okay?
Yeah, so to my knowledge, there isn't one way to look at all the FOIA logs at once. You sort of have to comb through them, unfortunately. But I will say that duplicate requests are absolutely okay. They will close out your request if you personally send the same FOIA twice. But you can definitely send the same FOIA as another person or organization. And I will actually say there is something called the rule of three in FOIA, where if 3 separate people or organizations make the same request, they will have to publicly, in theory, publicly post those records and not wait for a specific FOIAs to ask for them. So you can definitely submit duplicate requests.
Awesome. There was also a question in the chat about what general dates of records are covered for searches. And so this is a great question about specifying dates and what Emma mentioned about records retention.
Usually you'll put a date range in your request, and they will give you what they have. FOIA does not require them to make new records. So if you want a certain amount of information and you want them to put it in an easily accessible spreadsheet, they're not required to do that, and they won't do that. They'll give you the information in whatever form it exists. And if records have been deleted, they do not have an obligation to go and recreate that record. FOIA only requires them to give you what they have.
Awesome. Okay. Next question. So there was a request for clarification. Are state and county court records available through FOIA?
No. So each state has its own public information, its own version of FOIA. I don't know off the top of my head for all 50 states, but generally, the judicial branch is not subject to a local version of FOIA. Generally, there may be states where that's not the case. Courts do have, state and local courts do have their own rules and ways that you can get information, but FOIA or the state equivalent is generally not the best tool to use to get judicial records.
That is very helpful. Okay, next question. Can you share any additional tips about appealing and challenging redactions or exemptions? Are there some tried and true tricks that work for us?
More information is better. generally the person who is looking at an appeal is higher up and more of an expert than the person who is making the initial determination. So that can be helpful. But for example, we put in our FOIA requests that this is a subject for our fee waivers. Let's say this is a subject of widespread interest, and we'll cite to 1 or 2 news articles. And if they deny it, in the appeal, we're citing to 10 news articles. We are putting as much in an appeal to make our case as we can. In terms of redactions, you want to be able, like I said before, you're always going to be at an information disadvantage. You don't know what's under the redaction. So you are looking, you turn into a bit of a investigator. You're looking for any other clues in the record because, like I said, they have to segregate the information that they think is not, they're not able to withhold. So, for example, if this is, they're saying it is B5 and there's an attorney on, a lot of time if there's an attorney on an email, for example, they will call that attorney work product or attorney client privilege. But if there's a non-attorney as well, or the subject line is something that's clearly not a legal determination, or whatever information is that you can glean, or if you can use your own expertise of, I know the subject matter and I know they made a final decision on April 12th, 1947, or whatever time it is that you're looking for. And this email is from a year later about this subject. So it's past a final decision, but it does, for redactions, you have to sort of use context clues as much as possible because you just don't know what's underneath. And you can try to argue that based on the information you have, whatever is underneath should not be subject to that, that exemption.
There's a good question about drafting. So this project involves FBI investigations into non-citizens with names that are often misspelled. Requests have been submitted for a few people, but haven't yielded anything. Should I assume the search looked at permutations of names, or do I need to list every possible permutation?
Yeah, so I hate to say this, but I would assume that the search did not look at any permutations of names. When a FOIA officer is processing the request, they are really just going to go by the exact text of what you wrote out. And so, as much, that's sort of why I've been sort of trumpeting this idea as specific and as detailed as possible you can be, the better. They won't search for things that you haven't listed out. And that has sometimes been so frustrating on this end when it's sort of like I ask for a general type of record and I was like, oh, why didn't they just assume, like any common person, that briefing materials would include talking points? And it's sort of like as specific as possible as you can get, the better. So when it comes to the permutations of names, I would list out every single one just to cover your bases and ensure that when they say they don't have any records, you can be really confident in that.
There's another similar kind of project-based question. Someone is researching 2 individuals for biographical purposes and wanted to know where they show up in federal records. Knowing that they aren't people who have generated a lot of files, would it be possible or productive to request a general keyword search?
Yeah, you can definitely do a general keyword search. I would recommend in this case, because the names of the individuals are not likely to produce a lot, actually making this request very broad. So asking for sort of like any records that you have discussing this individual and listing out the different types of things you might expect, whether that's investigation files, briefing materials, proposals that were authored by this person. So as many different types of records you're thinking of, I would list out, but I definitely think you can go pretty broad in asking for these names. Yeah.
There is one question that I don't know if we know the answer to, but there is, NARA, the National Archives, has some good resources, but the question is, do you have advice for submitting FOIA requests for Civil War pension files? We've never gone that far back. And just curious if we had any potential thoughts. I did share a NARA link that might be helpful.
Nothing specific, unfortunately, not our area of expertise. But like I said before, in general, I would always, when you have submitted a request, generally there is some form email that comes back to you that has the name of the FOIA officer assigned to that request. Getting that person on the phone is the most helpful thing in almost all situations. Recently, a lot of requests, I think, to these agencies have probably been expedited requests, and there's a queue, and you could be continuing to be pushed down to the bottom of the queue for quite some time, as you saw with the 8-year thing. So getting someone on the phone, I think is my most helpful tip if you are running into a wall. It doesn't always get you what you want, and unfortunately, I'm the lawyer on the call to say the answer is sometimes litigation. If you need the request, if you need the records more quickly than you are getting them.
And we did have a great response in the chat that Civil War pension files are indexed for free on Family Search and also available through the National Park Service. So you learn something new every day. Going to the next question for Mark, and this is an excellent question. Can you revisit the 3 requests rule that you mentioned? If, say, a researcher wants specific materials to be posted for public access, would it be a good strategy to work with allies to have to submit 3 similar or identical requests? I'll let whoever wants to go for it, Khloe.
Yeah, I can start, and Emma, of course, feel free to jump in. You definitely can coordinate with other people to submit requests. I know that's been a big strategy in different like advocacy spaces when it comes to things like law enforcement training materials, trying to coordinate requests so they have to be disclosed. I will say, you know, FOIA offices don't always oblige by that rule. This was a rule that was passed in 2016 as part of the FOIA Improvement Act. And so in theory, if there are 3 identical requests that ask for the same materials, they should be posted publicly. It doesn't always come about that way in practice, but you can absolutely coordinate with that if you want them to be publicly posted for sure.
Wonderful. And we're down to, I think there's 3 more questions, one that was in the general chat, and a couple other ones. The one that was in the general chat was asking, someone is potentially doing a research project on student activism at Arizona State University in Phoenix area, 1960s to 75. They're interested in requesting FBI files for some of the students and faculty members and community members. Some folks are deceased, but some people are alive. Can I request their FBI files without tracking them down and getting their permission? This is an interesting one.
So generally the answer is no. That if somebody is alive, you'll need their permission. If they are someone who it was like an elected official or someone who has a lowered privacy interest, the answer may be different. Muckrock actually has a good, I'm going to put in the chat, flow chart for a beginner's guide to requesting an FBI file, which may be helpful to you. But generally, if someone is alive, you will need their permission for the FBI file.
Great resource. We'll make sure that we email that out as well. Another question that has come up was, are FOIA officers aware of older material that may have been transferred to the National Archives? Folks are dealing with an older period from 1910 to 1950, and requests to the agencies would likely go to Department of Justice or State Department. And this might be something where I don't know if we have quite as much experience on.
I think the answer is to probably submit your request to DOJ, state, and NARA. cover your bases, and when you have an assigned FOIA officer, see what information you can get out of them. They may know someone or know of a resource within their agency to find the best way to find these. So people, sorry that my answer continues to be talk to the FOIA officer, but it's generally the best way.
Another question, what amount of fees might you run up in making a FOIA request? Worst case scenario.
A lot, thousands. We're seeing crazier ones recently. You can always work with them to narrow, but they are allowed to charge fees for the time that it takes to respond to your request. And it can be, they can think it will be significant. Sometimes just doing the math and pointing that back out to them and saying, do you really think it will take this amount of hours for this many potential records to review them, can get them to come down. But you may be shocked at the initial number that you see. Think of it as an opening negotiation, which may involve you needing to narrow, but also sometimes you can get them to reconsider the estimated amount of time.
And going to our final question, I have the results. This is a unique question. The results of a FOIA request completed in the 1990s. The black markers used to redact have now faded, meaning I can read redacted materials that I couldn't in the 90s. Can I legally use that information? This is an interesting hypo.
I do not represent you. I am not your lawyer. There's probably another lawyer you should talk to. There is some case law that might be interesting to you about information that was accidentally released under FOIA, and whether or not organizations or a requester can use that information. The answer is not always no. So that's where it's an interesting question. I don't know. I've seen it specifically about faded markers, but there is case law about what the obligations of a requester are if they have accidentally received information under FOIA.
And what we can do too is, since that is a somewhat unique question, share that information in our roundup materials. But I want to thank everyone, especially those who stayed on for such a long and detailed presentation, and also for those of folks who were able to ask questions. We will be pulling together materials, our partnership's contact information, and hopefully that will aid you all in the requests that you submit that are hopefully successful, timely, and result in many, many records requests. And I will turn it back over to Beth to close us out.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Thank you, Emma and Khloe. This was a great discussion. And thank you, everybody in the audience who asked such great questions. As I mentioned at the beginning in the chat, in case you didn't see it, this recording will be available to everybody who registered. We will probably have it up and posted on our YouTube channel midweek next week, and you'll get an email with the link to that. But then we'll also pull together all of the stuff that the folks at American Oversight send us, and we'll send you links to that as well. So please have a wonderful weekend, and hopefully we will see you next week at our K-12 book club meeting on September 23rd, or our Birthright Citizenship webinar on September 24th, Or last but not least, we have our member meet and greet on Friday, next Friday at noon, where we'll be meeting with members of our Atlanta committee who will be talking about the work they do and the upcoming deadline for the Huggins Quarles Award. Thank you. Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you soon.